we've seen an attack of Hamas on Israel. Why did Israel not predict this attack? What was the problem?
That's an excellent question. I'm sure one the Israelis, both military intelligence and government, will be asking themselves as well as the Israeli people. My experience with this sort of thing is there are a number of factors, and I think they all are in play here with Israel. The first is arrogance or hubris. You have far too much confidence in your past abilities, as it were. The second is imagination and a lack thereof. And that goes right along with arrogance sometimes and is augmented by it. Because if you lack imagination, you cannot think about what your enemy might be creative in doing. And so you're stuck with the things that are rote with you. And I think that's very applicable to Israel here, particularly its intelligence services. And then the third reason, I think, is because you denigrate and dehumanize your standing enemy, in this case, the Palestinians, but particularly Hamas, and you don't think them capable of anything like what happened on October the 7th and is happening even now. You dehumanize them. Or as Gidon Levy, who is one of the most courageous Israeli journalists, works for Haaretz, has said, and I quote here, 2.3 million people living in a cage create some barbaric mutations. Well, on October the 7th, we saw one of those mutations in vivid form. You can't do what Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu, who blesses what he does, and others of this ultra-right, almost Nazi-like administration in Jerusalem now. You can't do the things they have done over the past few months and get away with it. And there's your testimony to the arrogance and the hubris that makes you think you're all powerful, and you're not. No state is.
How do you see the response of Israel to this attack? What are they doing, in your opinion? Is that logic? How did you find it?
They started out with their statements and such, which one tends to believe with Israel in circumstances like this in particular, being quite, in my view, stupid. And some of the statements have continued thusly, and we haven't helped. Paint this picture for yourself for a moment. The richest country in the world per capita, Israel, has more billionaires per capita than we do. Backed by the richest country in the world, is now attacking mercilessly, or plans to, the poorest, most impoverished, most oppressed people in the Middle East, the Palestinians, and particularly those in Gaza. There's your picture. That's a horrible, horrible picture. And then you add to this that richest nation having such people as Tom Cotton, that wonderful, grandiose former military member, Harvard graduate, stentorian senator of the great state of Arkansas, who stands up and says, quote, "As far as I'm concerned, Israel can bounce the rubble in Gaza." Now, that's a very telling statement for a military man. What bouncing the rubble means is you've killed every baby, woman, children, man, dog, cat, and now all you have left is the rubble to bounce around. Then he goes on to say, nothing should be off the table. Then he says, we will protect our interests. And my immediate question to Senator Cotton is, where on earth, Senator, do you find interest, U.S. interest, in bombing civilians? Where do you find that? Where do you find that? But not to be outdone, let's look at some of the statements, and I don't want to be anything but accurate here. These are statements by some of his counterparts in Israel. The state of Israel, I'm quoting, has no choice but to turn Gaza into a place that is temporarily or permanently impossible to live in. This is a reservist Major General Jorah Island writing in Yehodath Aronith, an Israeli newspaper, goes on to say, creating a severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza is a necessary means to achieve this goal. And he added, Gaza will become a place where no human being can exist. Not to be outdone, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said, we are fighting human animals. Let me repeat that. We are fighting human animals. and we're acting accordingly, unquote. Major General Hassan Alian said in Gaza, quote, there will be no electricity and no water. There will only be destruction. You wanted hell, you will get hell. That is not a way to start a campaign that the world will not wind up, not just your enemies, but perhaps your friends too, declaring a colossal war crime and a humanitarian disaster. That is not the way to start.
Terry, is that smart to talk this way? What they're pursuing through these kind of talks?
I think they're trying to justify the mistakes they made, and they, I mean, is the government. What we're looking at here is a government that failed catastrophically, an intelligence service that failed catastrophically, against, by their own statements, an enemy that wasn't even worth thinking hard about. They and I've got to say here too, an enemy with whom Netanyahu was tacitly allied, because Hamas was vehemently opposed to a two-state solution. So is Bibi Netanyahu. Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority were for a two-state solution. So Bibi used Hamas to undermine Mahmoud Abbas anytime he could, and the Palestinian Authority. So in a real way, he was allied with Hamas in bringing about what he wants, which is an end to any idea of a two-state solution. So you've got a really colossal failure on the part of Netanyahu. I would put it in the league with, in fact, I would even say it's worse than the 1973 war, Golda Meir. And we know that Golda didn't survive that ultimately. I don't think Bibi will survive this either. I think the Israeli people will throw him out. Here's another Israeli general who picked up a weapon and headed for the front when he found out what was going on. He said, there's no government in Israel, just citizens who care. Well, I hope he's right about that latter, that there are citizens who care not only about the defense of Israel, which they have a right to be concerned about now, but also about the rights of the people whom they're going to attack. But that sums it up. There's no government. There's Bibi Netanyahu and the Nazis that he assembled around him, like Ben-Gvir, who has been, by the way, conducting pogroms almost every week in the occupied territories amongst the settlers, using them as allies to do it against the Palestinians. So, I mean, who's guilty here? There's guilt on both sides. This reminds me of February 2022, when Putin brutally invaded Ukraine. Yes, terrible thing. I don't like to see the use of violence across territorial boundaries either, or even within them. But I understand the motivation Putin had. I understand it because of the expansion of NATO and what we were threatening to do on his borders. I understand Hamas also, and understand particularly the Palestinians. I don't condone it. It was horrible. I don't condone it. I don't condone the hostage taking. I think we have 14 Americans in there now, and maybe 150 or so Israelis. So 199, I guess, all told. I don't condone any of that, but I understand it. I understand it. Anyone like Tom Cotton, who's a senator, by God, a senator of the United States, that august body of people who are supposed to know better. I don't condone people like that standing up and say, make the rubble bounce. I don't care if they can do anything they want to. This is preposterous. We need cool and sane heads now. And by the way, we need cool and sane heads in the United States of America too.
How they gonna attack by these bombings? How they gonna attack Hamas? As we know, they're not living on the ground. They're living in the basements, some tunnels they have. I don't know how does it work there. Does it influence anything on the part of Hamas, in your opinion?
Probably not in the long run, in the scheme of things, military scheme of things. That's the way I'll look at it. In fact, it probably makes it more deadly for the Israeli forces going in, because there is going to be a lot of detritus. There's going to be a lot of concrete and rebar and all kinds of things that we found, for example, in Al Anbar province and in Fallujah in particular, make it easier for the people who are ducking in and out of places rather than the people who are coming in formation with weapons and so forth. It's very difficult. Urban fighting is the most difficult fighting of all. And to make the rubble even worse, makes it even more difficult, gives your enemy many more places to hide, many more avenues down which to run and escape and shoot at you again and again and again. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but neither did it make a lot of sense to roll in there in IDF fashion, Moshe Dayan, you know, with the tank formations and everything, and get yourself killed because you'd be exposed to all these different anti-tank weapons and so forth, IEDs. Did we see IEDs in Iraq and Afghanistan? That's the new weapon of choice when you're up against armor and you're just a naked civilian, so to speak, or a guerrilla fighter. So it's going to be dangerous in any event. And a humanitarian disaster, if we take 2 million people in the north of Gaza, force them, and you can't really do that. I mean, there's not a way to do that in any reasonable timetable like they're talking about. Why you're bombing them? It's just absurd. As Gideon Levy said again, you're going to perpetrate one of the greatest war crimes in the world. And that's not going to help your cause whatsoever. So I'm hearing now, and I'm seeing now what I have visibility into, which isn't much, unfortunately, the Israelis being more cautious and being more circumspect about how they're going to do this. The bombing it's simply, Gideon Levy many, many years ago, when I first encountered him, used to say to his audiences, you think the Israelis are killing that baby on the ground in Palestine? You think the F-16 that rolled in on that city and dropped those 250-pound Mark 72 bombs on those civilians, you think they're the guilty party? I'm telling you, you're guilty too. You sold them the F-16s and you put the bombs on the pylons. He's right. He's right. We have laws. I was at state when we should have exercised those laws. I was at state when the Israelis hovered an Apache helicopter outside a hotel room, shot some Hellfire missiles in there, and killed men, women, and children. They got the 2 Hamas people they wanted, but they also got their sons and their daughters and such. We were supposed to do something about that because we say they can't use our equipment for things like that. We didn't do shit. We didn't do anything. That's the state of the art here with the United States now. Israel can get away with just about anything. That said, I'm also hearing that President Biden has put his foot down with Netanyahu as to what he thinks should be the patina, the image that comes out of this. And it has nothing to do with the greatest war crime on the face of the earth and everything to do with being circumspect and I don't know what the or is. I hope it was a real threat. I hope it was a solid threat to Bibi. Biden's not want to do that with Bibi, but I hope he did. And I hope that registers with it, because not only were they incompetent, and not only are they trying to regain a sense of competence amongst their people again, which they won't, like Meir, like Golda Meir in 73, he'll be thrown out after this is over, or maybe in the middle of it if he's really, really bad at execution. But I don't think the IDF will be. I think they'll be solid at execution, but I'm not encouraged by the fact that you just said they're bringing these buildings down and doing something that really has absolutely zero impact on the Hamas fighters that they're after.
Is that a wise decision to go into Gaza, or you consider it as a mistake?
You know, they've already, if the statistics I'm getting, they've already suffered more casualties in a shorter time than Israel has ever before in its history since 1948. That's traumatic for Israel. It's traumatic for the IDF. They are going to suffer enormous casualties more additionally, certainly in their soldiers, as they move forward through this Gaza hellhole. And you're right, they're going to have to ferret out Hamas. They're going to have to go into the tunnels or flood the tunnels, is what they've done in the past. They're going to have to be guerrilla fighters themselves almost in order to match the guerrilla fighter on the other side in his venue, in his environment. That's going to be extremely difficult. There is no fighting in military annals more difficult, more complex, and more deadly than the kind of fighting, for example, Paulus's Sixth Army for the Wehrmacht did in Stalingrad, or that we did in Fallujah. City fighting, urban fighting is the most difficult form of fighting. And in this case, as you said, there's a lot of underground that the Hamas can retreat into and so forth. So, and you got to root each and every individual out of that complex. It's difficult fighting, extremely difficult fighting, and you're going to take a lot of casualties if you pursue it with vigor. I don't think they had any choice, they being Netanyahu and his generals. They've got to show, just as George W. Bush thought he had to show and did subsequently show after 9/11, that he was ready to use force and use it violently to avenge that tragedy. And for Israel, both in a sense of proportion and a sense of psychology, this is much worse, I think, than 9/11. This was an impregnable state, and now all of a sudden they've been shown not to be so, badly shown. Their intelligence entities have abysmally failed, just as ours did prior to 9/11. So you got to be kind of vicious, but I'll go back to Colin Powell's cautions to George W. Bush at the time. Be careful. Be very, very careful, because when you unleash the instrument of war, you have no real idea of what will evolve. You don't. Go back to Clausewitz in his book 8 in his On War, Vom Krieg. War has a habit of changing, majorly changing, as each bomb drops, as each population is attacked and casualties result. So they've got to be extremely careful as they seek their revenge. And Netanyahu is going to be seeking to demonstrate to the Israeli people that he's not the stumbling, bumbling idiot that he's demonstrated himself to be. And so he's going to be even perhaps more vicious in that regard. As to the United States, I hope we're counseling them. I hope Biden and Blinken, nod, nudge, that government that has shown me it doesn't even know how to do diplomacy, here wakes up and shows how it knows how to do the most powerful and necessary diplomacy of all, and that is restrain your ally, restrain your friends, restrain your cohorts when, in fact, they have been bloodied badly. And the human reaction is to get blood for blood, tooth for a tooth, eye for an eye, which, interestingly, as the old prophet used to say, leaves the world blind and toothless. Not a good strategy.
How they gonna fight an ideology? It seems that they're thinking of a physical thing that can be removed. Hamas is not physical, it's ideological, that they have to consider what are the roots of this ideology, where does it come from, how to deal with it. It seems to me that, like 9/11, they're trying to physically remove something, some people. Is that possible in your opinion?
No, you're right. You do not kill an ideology. You can kill everyone who espouses that ideology. You can't do that, actually. Physically, you can't do that, but you can try. And even if there's only one person left, that ideology, if it has any reverberation with the people around it at all, will come right back. Look at ISIS. ISIS is not holding territory anymore, but it's still out there, and it's still a threat. Al-Qaeda, still a threat. And by the way, this brutality that Israel proposes, if it carries it out to the fullest degree, I guarantee you we will have a revived Al-Qaeda, a revived ISIS, and a whole bunch of others spawned off of them, some of them attacking the United States and maybe Brazil and other places. It's just the way things like this happen. When you talk about ideologies, look at what Netanyahu was doing. He was using Hamas to support his own ideology, which was no two-state solution. And Hamas agreed with that, so he agreed with Hamas. Now, I'm not saying he was coordinating with them. I don't know that. But he certainly was using them to undermine the Palestinian Authority. There's where you've actually given some merit and substance to the ideology that you probably don't realize you're doing. When the elections happened in July 2006, as I recall, and Hamas surprised everybody, I was stunned at the people in the United States who were surprised, because I had told them all, Hamas is going to win, baby. They're going to win. You guys having these elections, this is stupid. I mean, just from the point of view of who's going to win, it's stupid. Well, what did we do? We had the elections and they won. And then Bibi and everybody else is convinced, including us, and I was there during some of this, we're convinced that Hamas wants to govern now. And so its ideology will be in the background and it wants to govern. Now we're seeing what they were doing in the background. They weren't thinking about governing, and I don't see how anybody could look at Gaza and think that they were thinking about governing. They were thinking about getting back and getting vengeance, and that's exactly what they've done now. So lack of imagination, arrogance, failure to consider your enemy's real wishes and terms, cooperating with your enemy in the sense of undermining Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. All these things led to this. And you're right. You cannot defeat an ideology. You cannot defeat an idea. You simply can't. You can balance an idea and ultimately make it weaker and weaker with another idea. But that idea of violence for violence ain't the way to do it.
When you look at the scale of this conflict that is happening in Israel, how do you see the risk of a new regional war in that part of the world?
You asked the $64 question in my mind, and our sending carriers over there to the eastern end of the Mediterranean maybe makes sound operational sense. I'm not sure it makes strategic sense unless we know something. We haven't been stellar in our intelligence entities either, particularly the CIA, the NSA, and the DIA, the three really strategic lookers out there at the world. What's this enemy going to do? What's this one going to do? And Putin's comments have not enthralled me at all as to the wisdom of moving forces around the way we seem to want to move forces around right now. Now, I'll give you a little bit of a hint here about carriers. Most Americans don't know this. Most of the world doesn't know this. One carrier means you can conduct operations for about 24 hours, then you got to stop and replenish and refuel. Two carriers means you can conduct it for about 48 to 96 hours. Three means you can do round the clock. As long as you can put your fuel ships in there and your ammo ships in there to resupply, you can do them around the clock. Means you think you're going to fight a real war. So what's the number of carriers? We've got one there, as I understand it, either there or almost there, and we've got one steaming to be there. That's two. Get three, we're really taking Putin seriously, we're taking Tehran seriously, and a number of others probably, because that means we're expecting something. That sends a signal because there are other military experts in the world like myself who understand that. And that sends a signal. So Biden, watch what you do, Mr. Commander-in-Chief. Don't be sending these signals. We could see Turkey involved. We could see Russia involved. We certainly could see Iran involved. And here's the one that should be frightening Israel right now. I'm sure it is in the corridors where they don't let it out. Hezbollah has missiles that are far greater in accuracy and devastation than Hamas. And Hezbollah showed back in July of 2006, as I recall, that they could hand the IDF a loss or two if they wanted to. And Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, has fallen off his political perch in Lebanon after the big explosion. He doesn't have the power he once had. So it doesn't take Iran to get him into it. The fact he wants to regain something with the Lebanese people and attacking Israel might gain it for him, might mean he want to enter it. They're already doing some little things on the border right now, taking Israel's attention off of the south. They could do it even more so. Yemen has threatened. Iran has made some rumblings. You're looking at the prospect for a wider conflict again. We've got that prospect in Ukraine, in the heart of Europe. We got that prospect now in the Levant. We got that prospect in other places too, around Taiwan and the South China Sea. This is not a good world we're building here. This is not a good world.
If we think of the worst case scenario for this conflict, if something happened, will Israel be able to handle a multi-front war?
I think it'll be a real challenge. I do, because of a number of things. First and foremost, because the IDF, once the premier force in the region, has been on occupation duty for 20 plus years. So a lot of its actual active forces, their skills have atrophied. You can't be on occupation duty for that many years and still maintain the kind of razor sharpness you did, for example, in the 67 war or the 73 war. You can't. You simply can't. So it's going to be a lot of the reserves who are in this. I think they've got about 360,000 or so called up right now and going to be in this battle, in this war. So there'll probably be more of those. But that's a problem, that you haven't fought a really full-scale kind of war that you're used to fighting in a long time, and your skills have atrophied some. Second, I don't think Israel would be that good at fighting a multi-front war. And when I say multi-front, I mean you've got the possibility of Hezbollah, you've got the possibility of forces supported by Iran coming through Syria and out of Syria. You've got the possibility, I think it's remote, but I don't know, of the Houthis sending people up. And you've also got the prospect that the Arab nations, if you are really, really brutal in prosecuting the response in Gaza, and this is Clausewitz again, war changes. Every day it changes, and your enemies change, and the people who want to participate change. You might even get some of the other Arab countries backing forces coming in. We know now that Saudi Arabia, for example, had a lot to do with the initial turmoil in Syria, that Saudi Arabia was sending fighters into Syria because they wanted to unseat Bashar al-Assad. They failed, but look at the mess they made in Syria along with us. So the potential for a real significant existential even problem for Israel is not over 50% here in my estimation yet, but there is the potential for it to be. We will not, let me hasten to add, we have said, and I believe it, we will not let that happen. So then you're in for a penny, in for a pound. Not only does the United States have a base with the stars and stripes flying over it in Israel for the first time since '48, we also have a major cybersecurity facility with the Israelis in Beersheba. So you're in for a penny, in for a pound, and the United States would be right there. And I guarantee you that would draw other actors into the battle.
When you look at the US policy in Israel, in Palestine, it comes to mind that do they really want peace in that region or not? Because it doesn't seem that the policy doesn't go the way it should go. It should make peace. How do you see this?
I think you're absolutely right. I don't think any government Israel has had for quite some time, certainly not one under Bibi Netanyahu, and that's about 15 years of governments, wants peace. They do not want peace. A group that I meet with every other Sunday, the Israel-Palestinian Confederation, is trying to set up a government over Hamas, over PA and over Israel, one that would function with them, with veto power for them, but also would give some kind of unity and build some kind of unity for the state that would then exist, a democratic state, not a Jewish state. Matter of fact, I was headed for Israel. Next month, I was headed for Israel. We're going to put up a big billboard, and the billboard says, "A Jewish state is not good for Jews." That was going to be our $30,000 commitment, if you will, to the situation. And we believe it. We think a Jewish state is not good for Jews. It is not. It's not a democracy. It can't be. You have two theocracies in the Levant right now that are really, really dangerous theocracies. One's in Tehran and one's in Jerusalem. And that's not going to work. So what you're talking about, in essence, is doing away entirely, which is got to be interpreted as part of Netanyahu's governing purpose, doing away entirely with democracy, and in its place installing a Jewish state.
Why the two-state solution was buried? How did they kill this two-state solution? What was the problem with this idea of having Palestinian state, Israeli state living together?
It started with my administration and George W. Bush. There were rumblings of it earlier amongst the neoconservatives in particular, a lot of whom are Jewish Americans or dual citizens. And it came to a head with that administration when Ariel Sharon, then prime minister, visited the Oval Office. I forget when it was, 2004, 2003, somewhere around there. And George W. Bush told him, in essence, which he had already communicated to his Secretary of State indirectly, that the roadmap, we called it, the roadmap to peace, the two-state solution and so forth, hadn't worked for 40 plus years. Therefore, it was dead. Arik, over to you. You got it now. What George W. Bush was saying to Sharon, who was Netanyahu's predecessor, remember, he was Minister of Defense when the Israelis invaded Lebanon and the refugee camps that were featured massacres unknown. This is Sharon, and Sharon is now the prime minister of Israel. And Bush tells him he has his head. Go back to Tel Aviv at that time and do what you need to do. And that was the policy. And as much as Powell met with Arafat, as much as Powell tried to bring the roadmap to fruition and a two-state solution on a road to some degree of success, he failed. He totally failed. In fact, the vice president, Dick Cheney, undercut him every time he tried to do it. Even as he was in Ramallah negotiating with Arafat, Cheney was cutting the bridge out from under him as he negotiated. Since that time, with the greatest ally we had ever found to do this, Bibi Netanyahu, Israel has not been interested in a two-state solution. That's why he was using Hamas. They aren't interested in it either, for different reasons, of course, but they don't want to live with the state of Israel. He doesn't want to live with the state of Palestine. So, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And now look what we've got.
When you look at the neocons ideology in Ukraine, you can understand totally what's the end game. But in Israel, what does neocon really want? What do they want from this conflict? Because this ongoing conflict is going to kill more Israelis, more Jews, more Muslims. And these people, most of them have nothing to do with this conflict. They're living their lives.
They have no skin in the game and no blood is risked. That's what I hate about them. I loathe them for that reason. They pontificate, Tom Cotton, they pontificate, but they have no skin in the game. Here's what they want. They want the United States of America in its full panoply of power in the region, destroying Syria, Iran, and anything else that gets in their way. That's what they want.
Do you think that the war in Ukraine is contributing to this mess that we are witnessing right now in Israel? Because we have this division right now between China, Russia, United States. These powers, these superpowers can work together to bring this conflict down, to solve this conflict, to calm this conflict. How do you see the war in Ukraine? How does it contribute to this conflict right now in Israel?
In a number of ways, but the one you just elucidated is the most serious, I think, and that is that, let's go back to the 73 war again, when I watched my infantry battalion disappear because I was going to stand up a brand new mechanized infantry battalion. I'm standing at the airfield getting ready to welcome some of the track vehicles coming into me to stand up my battalion, and poof, they go off to Israel, and that battalion was no longer. So I went back to my former unit. What was happening there was we were sending that equipment to Israel because it was in extremis. It was in dire need of new equipment and everything. That's essentially what we're looking at with today's situation, except the difference you just elucidated. Here we are. What were we doing at that time? It wasn't perfect, but we were negotiating with the Russians over the telephone, over the hotline. We were talking with others. The Chinese weren't quite in it yet in a big way, but we were talking with others. We were talking with India. We were talking with Japan. And we were bringing our, what we diplomats call good offices to bear on the problem. And everyone had an interest in not letting the conflict get out of control. You may recall Richard Nixon at the time. I've had people tell me, and I've looked at these people's records and I believe them. Nixon was so involved in Watergate at this time that he was halfway through a bottle of Jack Daniels by 5 o'clock every afternoon. The man who actually moved the United States of America's defense condition, a very strategic and dangerous move, was Henry Kissinger, because Nixon was not competent to do it. So Nixon was actually, moved off, and Henry Kissinger took over the presidency for that decision. We'll never know if that's totally true, but I've seen enough archival evidence and talked to enough people to think it is. The Russians cooperated, though, ultimately, and no one wanted a nuclear war. And the signals that were being sent and the back channel communications helped to get that conflict settled and stopped. There is some evidence even that the Israelis were contemplating moving a nuclear weapon or two to use on the Egyptian Third Army. That would have been one hell of a move. I hope that rumor, as it were, was not true, but it could well have been. We don't have that comedy today. We don't. We have Putin talking about the stupidity of the United States and doing what it's doing to support Israel. The stupidity. Putin was a friend of Netanyahu's. Netanyahu went out of his way to court Putin. He went out of his way to court Erdogan. That's all gone now, evaporated. And one wonders where the results will appear and how they will appear. But we've got a different world right now. And part of the problem and much of the reason for that different world is the United States of America.
Admiral John Kirby just recently said we are at the end of the rope in Ukraine. Literally means that no long-term support for Ukraine. How this conflict in Israel is affecting the war in Ukraine?
I hope two ways. I hope Kirby's statement was not just off the cuff. Admiral Kirby's not that sort of person, so I don't think it was. It was probably rehearsed. And I hope that was a statement to Putin that we're serious now. We want to sit down and we're going to talk and we'll get with you. Sergei Lavrov and Blinken, whatever it turns out to be. I hope it was also a statement to the Poles and others who are getting very weary of this conflict, and Germans too. And I also hope it was a recognition of the fact that, as occurred with the Iraq war and the Afghan war several years ago, the United States cannot spread itself too thin because then everything will go to hell. And that's what we're looking at. And if you want to put a calculus up on the wall and say, here's Israel, here's Ukraine, here's Japan, here's Korea, guess who's going to be at the top of that calculus? For domestic political reasons, which are very powerful, but also for geostrategic reasons, Israel, right up there at the top. So anything else that's happening that detracts from that is going to have to stop or be slowed or be fixed in some way. And that's what you're going to see happen.
The solution that Putin suggested was this acceptance of Palestine as a state. And this is going to be the first step, in his opinion. It seems that China has the same idea on Palestine and Israel. Some people say that this two-state solution is gone, is dead.
But most people say that, I think. Most concerned people and smart people say that because they see another solution as burgeoning, and that is a single state that's a democracy. Looks after all its citizens the same, or roughly the same. No democracy is perfect, but you have a single state, but it's a democracy. It's not a Jewish state. It's not a theocratic state. It's a democracy. And that's the first principle of that state. They think that's a better idea than the two-state because they think the two-state is gone. So I just wanted to qualify that.
Don't you think still we can have a two-state solution the way we have in Cyprus? We have North Cyprus and South Cyprus. We have two different, ethnically different, the religion is different, Muslim and Christian, and we have the presence of UN in between. Can we have something like Cyprus in Israel?
I think the ideal solution is what I just suggested, the single state that's a true democracy. But your point, whether it's an interim step to that ultimate step or whether it's a permanent step, as like you said, Cyprus, I don't know. You might be right on that you could never get to the final step of a real democracy encompassing 7.5 million Jews and 7.5 million Palestinians between the river and the sea. I mean, that would be ideal in my view. But if you had to put them in two separate states and then come up with some kind of DMZ or a UN force or whatever in between them for 75 years or whatever, how long Cyprus been going on, that would be an acceptable solution. But you can't do it with people like Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu and the people who are backing them. And let's face this. My friends do not want to face this, both Jewish and Gentile. They do not want to face this. The bulk of the Israeli people voted for Bibi Netanyahu and have voted for him time and time and time again. So if Bibi screwed up, and he did big time, so did the Israeli people. You can't escape that. So there's got to be a volte-face. There's got to be a face change, a real change in the way the Israeli people, or at least a majority of them, look at the situation to even go after a two-state solution, let alone the democracy that is one state.
You have two answers to this attack of Hamas. One is the quick answer of the state. The other one is the long-term response. You have to think of the well-being of Israelis, of the people who are living in Israel. And through this conflict, through these wars, nothing good is going to come out.
You're absolutely right. You have to think, if you're the leader of Israel, you have to think that with every bomb you drop and every civilian you kill, you are making your solution that much more difficult. With all the destruction and devastation that these generals I've quoted and the Minister of Defense, with all that they suggest and Tom Cotton suggests, you are making your problem intractable. You're making it unsolvable. You're making it a disaster. What do you do with that? You stop somewhere in there and you revisit all of your priorities. And this has to be the bulk of the Israeli people. And you get new leaders. As I said, Golda Meir did not outlast her failures in 1973. I think Bibi will go faster than she did. She lingered for a while. They will get rid of Bibi, I think. I don't think all of his adroitness and his hard rightness and his coalition making and everything else will save him this time. It's just that right now the fever's up, the passion's up, the revenge aspect of it is up. And so we're going to do that. But Bibi, you're going when this is over. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody hadn't already said that to him. But, we'll see. I just don't think he can survive this. Then he goes to jail, and his wife too, probably. But where do we go from there? We need a new leadership that sees things more or less like you and I have just discussed, whether it's two states or a single state, and sets in motion powers and forces that are aimed at that. How would that happen? It won't happen without the empire making it happen. I don't think the Israelis are capable of it. The empire must step in and say quite unequivocally, you will not survive without us. You know that. You cannot survive without us. You know that. We are going to back off if you don't do something positive and do it swiftly and well. Where are we going to find a president like that? Where are we going to find a Congress like that who will back him up?
How do you see the Biden administration in bringing logic, in bringing reality to the mind of the Netanyahu administration?
I think you first have to do it for yourself, answering your question truthfully, because we've been all over the world in our still ongoing global war on terror, doing essentially the same thing, trying to eradicate ideologies, eradicate people, eradicate tribes, eradicate anyone that doesn't agree with us, and all in the name of furthering democracy and spreading goodwill and all this kind of stuff. That's preposterous. And Israel's just more straightforward about it. We're going to kill you because you are a threat to us. We're going to kill you. And we don't think you own this land. We think we do. We're going to kill you. That's Israel's posture. So we both got to revise and revamp how we look at the globe. It's important that we do, because as we do, as you've implied, so will Israel, to a degree anyway. If we don't find a president, if we don't find a Congress, if we don't find a leadership in this country that understands we're driving our empire over a cliff, and we're going to take Israel with us, and maybe some others too, if we're not careful, if we don't figure that out and go to the ballot box and put people in who are different than Tom Cotton or Donald Trump or some of these other idiots, absolute idiots we've elected to the U.S. government in the last decade or two, and stop this global war on terror, look at what we're doing in Africa with it. It's unconscionable what we're doing in Africa. We've militarized all of our policy towards Africa. If we don't stop this, your question, the implications of your question are going to come true. We're going to have a miserable, miserable next generation.
Lindsey Graham is suggesting bombing Iran. What they're looking for, what they're aiming at, in your opinion.
And how preposterous all this is. I belong to the All Volunteer Force Forum, And we've been pointing out to the Congress for some time now. And this year has fulfilled all of our worst expectations. All the services, but the Marine Corps fell short on their enlistments. And their enlistments are down, really down in terms of how many they're trying to get. You have a situation where Lindsey Graham is spouting off with no sword in his hand. He thinks he has a sword in his hand, but it's plastic. It was made by Mattel. There is no ability of the United States other than nuclear weapons to be making all these bellicose statements and all these threats. There simply is not. And the idea that we can bomb everybody with our airplanes and our missiles and our drones and everything, it's been disproved completely in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it'll be disproved again and again and again in the future. So I find people like Lindsey Graham reprehensible, despicable. They're out there with no skin in the game themselves, none whatsoever. What was Lindsey? A judge, advocate, general lawyer. Lindsey has no military skills whatsoever, and he's out there talking about fighting yet more wars with more countries. This is preposterous, but this is what we've become.